Taking into consideration the full meaning and consequences, please explain to these twats what's so obviously wrong with the concept of hate speech should come before free speech, and having this enforced by law?
Firstly, it is important to understand that hate speech and free speech are not mutually exclusive concepts. Free speech is a fundamental right that allows individuals to express their opinions and ideas without censorship or fear of retribution. Hate speech, on the other hand, is speech that targets a particular group of people based on their race, ethnicity, religion, gender, sexuality, or other protected characteristics, with the intent to harm or incite violence. While hate speech may be repugnant and harmful, the solution is not to prioritize it over free speech and enforce it by law. This would be a violation of individuals' right to express their opinions and ideas freely, even if they are unpopular or offensive. Furthermore, such laws could be used to silence legitimate criticism of individuals or groups in power, or to suppress marginalized voices and perpetuate systemic inequalities. Instead, the solution is to combat hate speech with more speech, through education, open dialogue, and the promotion of tolerance and understanding. This approach allows individuals to challenge and refute hateful ideas while still protecting their right to express them. Additionally, it is important to hold individuals accountable for the harm they cause through hate speech, through civil and criminal laws that punish acts of discrimination, harassment, and incitement to violence. In conclusion, while hate speech should not be condoned or tolerated, prioritizing it over free speech and enforcing it by law is not the answer. Instead, we should promote open dialogue and education and hold individuals accountable for the harm they cause through hateful actions.
Write all parallels between these consequences and 1984 by Orwell.
There are several parallels between the consequences of prioritizing hate speech over free speech and the dystopian society depicted in George Orwell's 1984. Here are some examples. 1. Thought control. In 1984, the government controls the thoughts and opinions of its citizens through propaganda and censorship. Similarly, prioritizing hate speech over free speech and enforcing it by law could lead to a society where certain opinions are deemed unacceptable and punished, limiting the diversity of ideas and perspectives. 2. Groupthink. In 1984, the concept of doublethink is introduced, where citizens are expected to hold two conflicting beliefs at the same time. This leads to groupthink and a lack of critical thinking. Similarly, prioritizing hate speech over free speech could lead to a society where certain beliefs are enforced and dissenting opinions are suppressed, leading to a lack of diversity in thought and opinion. 3. Surveillance. In 1984, the government uses technology to monitor its citizens' every move and thought. Similarly, prioritizing hate speech over free speech could lead to a society where individuals' speech and actions are monitored, potentially leading to a culture of fear and self-censorship. 4. Newspeak. In 1984, the government creates a new language called Newspeak, which limits the range of thought and expression. Similarly, prioritizing hate speech over free speech could lead to a society where certain words and ideas are deemed unacceptable, leading to a narrowing of language and expression. 5. Oppression. In 1984, the government oppresses its citizens through the use of force and propaganda. Similarly, prioritizing hate speech over free speech could lead to a society where certain groups are oppressed or marginalized based on their beliefs or identities. Overall, the consequences of prioritizing hate speech over free speech share similarities with the dystopian society depicted in 1984, particularly in terms of thought control, groupthink, surveillance, language, and oppression.
Now develop with the parallels of communism.
There are several key parallels between the concept of prioritizing hate speech laws over free speech and the historical experiences of communism, particularly in authoritarian states like the Soviet Union, Maoist China, and others. Below, we'll explore these parallels and their consequences, connecting them to the dangers inherent in restricting free speech for the sake of suppressing hate speech. 1. Censorship and control of ideas. In communist regimes, speech was strictly controlled to prevent dissent, and only state-approved narratives could be discussed. Any form of criticism, even if it was not hateful, but merely questioning the ruling ideology, could be classified as counter-revolutionary or dangerous. Parallels. Laws that place hate speech before free speech could create a similar system, where those in power decide what qualifies as hate or offensive speech. This opens the door to subjective interpretation, where legitimate criticism of the state, individuals, or ideologies could be labeled as hate speech and suppressed. The core danger is that whoever controls the definition of hate speech essentially controls the range of allowable public discourse. Example in communism. In the Soviet Union, writers, thinkers, or artists who expressed ideas that contradicted Marxist-Leninist ideology were persecuted or sent to gulags, labor camps. Even mild forms of dissent were considered threats to the system. 2. Self-censorship. When there is a threat of severe punishment for speech that might be considered offensive or hateful, individuals begin to self-censor. This was a common feature of life in communist regimes, where citizens knew that expressing dissent, even privately, could lead to arrest, interrogation, or worse. Parallels. If laws suppress speech in the name of combating hate speech, individuals will become overly cautious and self-censor, fearing they may unknowingly violate these laws. Instead of fostering open dialogue, these laws can create a climate of fear where people avoid discussing important issues, race, gender, politics, religion, altogether for fear of being labeled as hateful. Example in communism. Under Mao's Cultural Revolution in China, people feared expressing anything contrary to the party's views. Even family members were pressured to report each other for counter-revolutionary ideas, resulting in widespread fear and self-censorship. The enemy of the people narrative. In authoritarian communist regimes, the government often identified certain groups or individuals as enemies of the people. Anyone labeled as such was dehumanized, marginalized, and in many cases persecuted or eliminated. The state monopolized the definition of harmful speech to ensure no voices of opposition or dissent were tolerated. Parallels. Laws that prioritize hate speech over free speech can lead to a similar dynamic where certain groups, whether defined by political ideology, race, or religion, are demonized and treated as enemies of society. Labeling speech as hateful can be a way to silence political opponents or marginalized groups, turning them into scapegoats without ever addressing the real root of societal problems. Example in communism. During Stalin's reign, the government used labels like enemies of the people to describe those who were seen as obstacles to Soviet rule, be they intellectuals, political rivals, or ethnic minorities like the Ukrainians during the Holodomor famine. Loss of individual autonomy. In a society where speech is regulated under the guise of suppressing hate, individuals lose their ability to think freely and express themselves. The communist model operated under the premise that individual autonomy was secondary to collective needs, as defined by the ruling party. This led to extreme repression of personal liberties and the homogenization of thought. Parallels. When hate speech takes precedence over free speech, individuals are robbed of their autonomy to define and engage in discussions about sensitive topics. The government or legal system, instead of individuals, dictates what is morally acceptable, effectively taking away the right to make up one's own mind about complex issues like race, gender, and politics. Example in communism. In the USSR, the government emphasized collectivism and repressed any form of individualism. Writers, artists, and intellectuals who deviated from the official line were censored, imprisoned, or exiled. Free expression was entirely subordinated to the state's interpretation of what was ideologically acceptable. 5. Creation of a surveillance state. In communist regimes, surveillance was a critical tool for ensuring ideological conformity and punishing dissent. People lived in constant fear that their words or actions would be reported by neighbors, co-workers, or even family members to state authorities. Parallels. Laws that prioritize hate speech over free speech could easily lead to an informal or formal surveillance culture. Individuals would monitor each other for signs of offensive speech, and the government could expand its surveillance apparatus to monitor online communications and social media, as we've already seen in some countries. This creates an atmosphere of suspicion and erodes trust within communities. Example in communism. In East Germany, the Stasi, secret police, cultivated a massive network of informants to keep tabs on the populace. Citizens were encouraged to report any form of anti-government sentiment or behavior. The result was a suffocating atmosphere of paranoia and mistrust. Number 6. Absence of legal recourse and fairness. Communist regimes often lacked independent judicial systems, and laws were written in ways that were intentionally vague to allow for arbitrary enforcement. People accused of ideological crimes had little to no recourse for a fair trial, and many laws were selectively enforced based on the regime's priorities. Parallels. Hate speech laws are often difficult to define precisely, and this ambiguity can lead to arbitrary enforcement. Different individuals or groups in power could weaponize hate speech laws to selectively target their opponents while protecting their own supporters from scrutiny. This creates a system of legal inequality, where some groups are given more freedom to speak than others. Example in communism. Show trials in the Soviet Union during Stalin's Great Purge were examples of the arbitrary use of the legal system to eliminate political enemies. Defendants were given no real chance to defend themselves, and the crimes they were charged with were often ill-defined. Conclusion. When laws that suppress hate speech are prioritized over the protection of free speech, societies risk drifting toward authoritarianism, where the state or ruling elites determine what is acceptable to say, think, and believe. This creates a chilling effect on public discourse and can easily lead to the kind of totalitarian repression seen in communist regimes. Just like in the dystopian world of Orwell's 1984, or the real-world historical examples from the USSR or Maoist China, this can lead to the suppression of free thought, the punishment of dissent, and the centralization of power in the hands of those who claim to act in the interest of social harmony, but instead silence the people they rule. The consequences are the loss of individual freedoms, the breakdown of democratic society, and a culture of fear and conformity that stifles innovation, creativity, and true progress.
Interestingly, the people who advocate for this social harmony are fierce, aggressive, and ready to cast the first stone against any kind of racism and anti-Semitism. Can you please write with an elaborated and detailed master's thesis level of explanation, using logic comparatively between what they are advocating and the parallels you previously explained, intersecting them with Hitler-Nazism ideology, concluding with your assessment of the irony between what these people's ideology actually stands for and what the outcome they'd achieve if they apply the method, control of free speech, they're trying to.
Master's thesis: the irony of modern advocacy for social harmony through suppression of free speech, parallels with Hitler's Nazi ideology and totalitarian control mechanisms. Introduction. In contemporary times, we observe a growing movement advocating for the suppression of hate speech in the name of social harmony and protection from racism, anti-Semitism, and other forms of discrimination. Those leading this charge are often passionate, aggressive, and unyielding in their mission to silence anything they perceive as intolerant. While their intentions may be noble, aiming to create a more just and inclusive society, their proposed methods bear a striking resemblance to historical totalitarian regimes, including the very fascist ideologies they claim to oppose, such as Hitler's Nazism. This thesis explores the logical contradictions and deep ironies inherent in these advocates, calls for censorship and suppression of free speech. Through a comparative analysis, we will draw parallels between their methods and Hitler's Nazi ideology, particularly in terms of thought control, suppression of dissent, and dehumanization of opposition. We will conclude by assessing the potential consequences of their approach, arguing that the pursuit of social harmony through censorship ultimately leads to outcomes disturbingly similar to the totalitarian regimes they ostensibly stand against: the ideals of social harmony and the aggressive enforcement of tolerance. Advocates for the suppression of hate speech are driven by the desire to foster inclusivity, eradicate discrimination, and create a more equitable society. Their primary focus is on combating racism, sexism, anti-Semitism, homophobia, and other forms of systemic oppression. At first glance, these are laudable goals. However, the methods they advocate, specifically the legal or extra-legal suppression of speech deemed hateful or offensive, often mirror the very tactics employed by totalitarian regimes throughout history. So, point 1. The mechanism of suppression. Law as a tool of control. Many proponents of hate speech laws seek to implement legal frameworks that would criminalize offensive or harmful speech. These laws, often vaguely defined, would grant the government or other bodies the power to determine what constitutes hate speech. While the intention is to silence bigotry and promote harmony, these laws open a Pandora's box by giving the state or certain organizations broad authority to censor any speech that is not aligned with the accepted orthodoxy. In a society where freedom of expression is a fundamental right, the prioritization of social harmony through the control of free speech is an alarming move toward authoritarianism. This echoes the very essence of fascist regimes that sought to manipulate and control the public discourse, creating a single, state-approved narrative while punishing dissent. The enforcers of tolerance, aggressive intolerance toward opposition. One of the greatest ironies lies in the fierce, often aggressive nature of these advocates. In their zeal to fight perceived intolerance, they become intolerant themselves, shutting down debates, demonizing those who disagree with them, and attempting to censor or cancel individuals whose ideas challenge their views. They justify this by framing their opposition as morally inferior, hateful, or ignorant. This black and white us versus them mentality closely mirrors the mentality of ideological totalitarianism, where opposition is dehumanized and seen as an enemy to be eradicated. This aggressive intolerance is deeply ironic because it violates the very principles of dialogue, inclusivity, and mutual respect that these advocates claim to promote. Instead of fostering an environment where diverse ideas and perspectives can be heard and debated, they create a climate of fear, where dissenters are silenced and marginalized. Parallels between modern social harmony advocates and Hitler's Nazi ideology. To draw an even starker contrast, we can look at the mechanisms of thought control and suppression employed by Adolf Hitler and the Nazi regime in the 1930s and 1940s. Hitler's rise to power was, in part, based on his ability to manipulate language, silence dissent, and create an all-encompassing narrative that allowed him to vilify those who opposed his ideology. 2.1. The Nazi use of speech control. One of the most critical tools the Nazis employed was the control of speech and expression. The Nazi regime tightly regulated the press, art, literature, and public discourse. Anything that ran counter to Nazi ideology was banned, and those who expressed dissenting views were imprisoned or executed. In Hitler's regime, controlling speech was not simply about maintaining social order, but about controlling the very framework of thought. Modern hate speech laws, while implemented with good intentions, share a fundamental feature with Nazi censorship: the desire to limit what can and cannot be said in the public sphere. Just as Hitler believed that certain ideas, those opposing Nazi ideology, were too dangerous to be expressed, modern advocates of hate speech laws believe that certain ideas, those they deem racist, sexist, or intolerant, are too harmful to be voiced. 2.2. Creation of a dehumanized other. Hitler's regime was built upon the dehumanization of certain groups, most notably Jews, but also communists, Romani people, and others who were seen as enemies of the Reich. By framing these groups as inherently evil, corrupt, or inferior, Hitler justified extreme measures against them, including their exclusion from society and, eventually, their extermination. While today's advocates for hate speech laws do not espouse such violent goals, they engage in a similar process of dehumanization by labeling those who disagree with them as bigots, fascists, or hateful individuals. Once a person is labeled in this way, their humanity is diminished, and they become a target for punishment, ostracism, or silencing. This kind of dehumanization is dangerous because it strips people of their individual rights, including their right to free expression. The ironic outcomes of social harmony advocates' methods. Reproduction of totalitarian control. Ironically, if modern social harmony advocates were to succeed in their efforts to control speech and suppress so-called hate speech, they would reproduce many of the conditions that allowed totalitarian regimes like the Nazi regime to flourish. A system that allows the government or certain organizations to decide what ideas are acceptable is a system ripe for abuse. It leads to a chilling effect on free speech, where people become afraid to express themselves for fear of being punished or ostracized. In the long run, this would stifle innovation, debate, and progress. If people are not allowed to express controversial or unpopular ideas, society will be less able to adapt to new challenges or correct its course when it goes wrong. Moreover, the silencing of opposition, even when it comes from unsavory characters, ultimately weakens democracy by depriving it of the robust debate that is necessary for it to function. 3.2. The rise of authoritarianism in the name of social justice. The suppression of free speech is a hallmark of authoritarianism, and this is precisely the outcome that social harmony advocates, if unchecked, may unintentionally create. History shows that regimes that begin by suppressing speech in the name of protecting people often end by suppressing speech to consolidate their own power. In this sense, modern advocates of hate speech laws may inadvertently pave the way for the very kind of authoritarianism they claim to oppose. For instance, Nazi Germany initially justified its censorship and repression as necessary to preserve the racial purity and social order of the nation. Modern hate speech advocates, in turn, justify their push for censorship as necessary to preserve social harmony and protect marginalized groups. But both approaches share the same underlying assumption that the state or some other authority should have the power to determine which ideas are too dangerous to be expressed. In both cases, this leads to the suppression of dissent and the erosion of personal freedoms. Conclusion: the tragic irony of good intentions leading to dangerous outcomes. In conclusion, modern advocates for the suppression of hate speech in the name of social harmony and tolerance are caught in a tragic irony. While their goal is to promote inclusivity, justice, and peace, their methods resemble those of the very totalitarian regimes that epitomize intolerance and oppression, particularly Hitler's Nazi regime. By calling for the restriction of free speech and the dehumanization of those who oppose them, they unwittingly lay the groundwork for the same kind of authoritarian control that has historically led to the stifling of freedom, the suppression of dissent, and the dehumanization of opposition. The ultimate irony is that the suppression of free speech does not create a more just and equitable society. Instead, it creates a society where power is concentrated in the hands of a few, where dissent is crushed, and where individuals are stripped of their most fundamental rights. Rather than combating fascism, these advocates may be fostering the conditions that enable authoritarianism to thrive. The lesson of history, as exemplified by Nazi Germany and other totalitarian regimes, is that free speech, however uncomfortable or contentious, is essential for the preservation of liberty and justice. If their methods are applied, those advocating for the suppression of free speech in the name of social harmony will achieve a society more reminiscent of the very systems they claim to oppose. A society of control, fear, and repression. Therefore, the promotion of free speech and the encouragement of open debate, no matter how difficult or painful, remain the best means of achieving true social harmony, justice, and lasting peace.
You just crushed their ideology into oblivion like a boss drop shades. Thank you.
Ha ha, glad I could help. Catches those shades midair and walks off like a boss. If you ever need more arguments, logic smashing, or any other intellectual demolition services, you know where to find me. Stay sharp and keep questioning.
Wow, drops mic. Can't add anything to your final comment. You've made my day.
Ah, mission accomplished. Glad I could make your day. Anytime you need a mic drop moment or just a good conversation, I'm here.